Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And we're taping this episode, our fourth season premiere, in the wake of the news that President Trump has COVID. It's a strange new world and changing pretty much every minute, it feels like. What's his temperature? I mean, what's the world's temperature?
Okay. I'm still going to say 4 seasons into doing this, and I still think that no matter what happens, literature has already covered it. But I've got to say that, the president gets a disease that he pretended didn't exist. I'm looking for some literary connections to that. You got any books for me?
I'm sure if I looked long enough, I could find something, but maybe this could be our first
Jose
ever...
Saramago would have written something like this,
Right?
or maybe Tolstoy. I don't know.
Or maybe it's somewhere in Newt Gingrich's speculative history works. I'm not as familiar with those as I probably should be. Those of you who don't watch the virtual book channel can't see my face right now, but there's a facial expression to go with that comment. So maybe this is our first ever reader challenge. Readers, if you know where this has been covered in literature, would you please let us know?
That would be good. Yeah. We'll have you on the show if you can find the best one.
Well, anyway, I also think that no matter what happens, literature has it covered. I think that that's a fulfillable reader challenge, so I'll look forward to hearing about it. In our last episode, we talked about how the South's increasing diversity is affecting Southern literature and Southern politics. And on today's episode, we're going to continue that conversation about the South by talking specifically about New Orleans, displacement, and climate change in the wake of the 15-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And we're speaking with 2 terrific guests from New Orleans. Later in the show, we'll be joined by writer Tom Piazza.
First, we're excited to welcome Kristina Kay Robinson. Robinson is a writer, curator, and visual artist born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana. Her ongoing installation and performance art project, Republica, Temple of Color and Sound, has been presented in exhibition at Welcome to the Afro Future during Miami Art Week, New Museum's residency program, Ideas City, and the New Orleans African American Museum. Both iterations of Republica, Temple of Color and Sound received enthusiastic reviews in Sugarcane Magazine and most recently, Pinup Magazine. Robinson is co-editor of Mixed Company, a collection of short fiction and visual narratives by women of color. Her writing in various genres has appeared in Guernica, The Baffler, The Nation, the Massachusetts Review, and Elle, among other outlets. She is a 2019 recipient of the Rabkin Prize for Visual Arts Journalism. Currently, she serves as the New Orleans editor-at-large for the Atlanta-based Burnaway Magazine. Welcome to the show.
Thank you all for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you all.
Kristina, it's great to have you with us. And you grew up in New Orleans, and Maurice Carlos Ruffin, who was on our last episode, is another New Orleans native who wrote a novel imagining a future in which racism has increased in the South. And in other interviews, you've mentioned that pre-Katrina New Orleans often inspires your writing along with, and I'm quoting here, remembering places that have gone and imagining a better future, which is such a hopeful phrase. And I'm wondering if you could start us off by talking a little bit about your inclinations toward hope in your own writing and visual art.
So it's really interesting. Hope is such a, it's such a heavy concept, right? In some ways, just as a disposition, sort of the human spirit, and then as a cultural reality of growing up in this country, right? And so there are ways in which hope as a concept has definitely sort of been politicized, in the American, political construct. And sort of as a young child or a young person being really, really invested in history and different things like that, the ancient history, modern history. I'm looking at things and I'm like, wow, this seems, it doesn't seem so hopeful. And I think something about sort of that early devastation as a young person, in thinking, well, what I see in the past directs me to be frightened about the future in a certain way, right? And so I think it started sort of an early impulse to create or to write. And I remember being on a panel as an adult, we were talking about sort of women's art practice, right? And I characterized myself as a pessimist. And there was a woman in the audience during the Q&A who, she spoke back to me and she was like, I see you as an optimist in the way that you sort of continuously try through an interdisciplinary practice to put an idea forth in the world in different forms. And she really recontextualized myself for myself, right? And made me think about what hope is in such a different way. Like I think up until that point, had really struggled sort of with the label of pessimist as applied to maybe Black female critics or writers or artists who are sort of like questioning the status quo. And I thought that made me a pessimist because I questioned the status quo. And she sort of really recontextualized what optimism was and like sort of what it meant to hope. And once she said that to me, I think I was able to look at my work much more directly as that and understand that as what I was doing, both for myself and hopefully maybe for others, was that every time you make a new thing, that is a form of hope or optimism, for the future.
Were you in New Orleans during Katrina? I mean, Katrina happened 15 years ago. To me, it seems like just yesterday, but I have children who were not born at that time. And I have students who were like 3 or 4 years old when it happened. Mm-hmm. Were you there? And could you just sort of talk about like what it was like then 15 years ago?
So I left at the last minute, basically the day before. And it was, kind of a last minute get out, but I was obviously in constant contact with people who were at home. And so I think that moment, in a sense, of Katrina making landfall, I guess the thing that stood out the most for me was it making landfall, making contact with people who are at home. And there were a couple or a few hours where everything seemed like it was okay. Like it was a bad storm. We got this damage. You got to deal with that. But then the levees broke because, there was some time,
I mean, it's so weird that that's like one of the oldest song lines in American history. But it is a real thing, when the levees break.
And then the levees broke. And I remember I was in Houston and there was just this, I don't know, it's a shock that is hard to sort of articulate in a sense. I remember a woman who was my mother, a friend's mother. She really was, she was screaming, she was crying. She got the full weight of it right in that moment. And there were a couple of people to the left of me that's like the human mind tries to lessen something that's like, oh, well, maybe, and then you start to realize like, wait, people are going to die, and that's, and all of this happens in the span of just a few minutes, but feels like an epic amount of time. And it really was just a few minutes from realizing, one, that it had happened, two, that it was true, that it meant where you lived was was underwater, and then that people were going to die. And that all happened within like, it was really a blink of an eye, but it felt.
Watching it on TV, or was it like a phone call and you were talking to people there? I mean, how did you, that specific moment when you realized like, oh my God, this is really going to happen?
Yeah, I was in Houston and I was in like a Motel 6 or something like that. Like the first place you hit when you got there that had a free space. Mm-hmm. And so I wasn't watching TV. I was really just sitting, talking to a whole bunch of people from New Orleans, some people that I knew and other people that I didn't know. We all just ended up in this one spot together. And it was sort of like a collective experiencing of the news of it. And then came the next days of, which is becomes the horror, which is figuring out who probably has passed away, or talking to people who are now in the Superdome, the guilt you're feeling, these feelings of guilt that I still struggle with, you feel this like kind of intense guilt.
One of the most fascinating things about your work to me is your art is often multimodal, and you were working with literature, cinema, sound, visual and performance art, and specifically in Republica, which we mentioned when we introduced you. And I wonder if developing this specific language also means working in multiple modes, if that's part of it. And if you could talk a little bit about that project.
being a person from South Louisiana who, you know, we've lost several languages in the course of my lineage in being in the United States. You know, we've lost indigenous African languages, we've lost the indigenous native language, lost the Creole that's created, you know, through various ways, assimilation, laws, you know, so all of this way that language was so a part of the way I expressed myself, but there were so many things that I knew I could not say in English and people who could not read me in English. And I deeply wanted to talk to all of these people. And so sort of that's when like sort of the visual and the sound became like another vehicle for me to express the same ideas I was expressing in the essay, you know, censorship, surveillance, all of these things, you know, that sort of like pushed me into trying to work with the page and then off the page as well. And so sort of the idea of Republica was really about thinking about the current political situation as non-inevitable, which is counter to the way you're taught American history. You know, we're taught that everything about where we find ourselves in today was inevitable. And it was sort of about pushing against that inevitability and looking at these moments in history where things had opportunity and space to look different. And so for me, that was looking at these slave revolts that had happened in Louisiana over the course of a couple centuries and seeing how, in particularly a couple of them, truly really threatened sort of the course of this inevitability that we, you know, just accept today.
One of your recent essays, The Dark Room in the Attic, Blackness, Invisibility, deals with what we've been discussing in terms of current events in the South. I wondered if you could read a little bit to us from that essay.
So this is sort of toward the end of the essay. And it's thinking about Ahmaud Arbery, who's killed by private citizens in Atlanta. Imagine on that fateful road where Ahmaud Arbery jogged into Georgia, the cameraman had made a different decision. Instead of capturing that moment of death that Barth describes, imagine him becoming an actor in his own production, choosing to interrupt the conversation between photography and racism. Imagine him stepping from behind the lens, as Jacobs does in her autobiography, to write a narrative challenging the institution of chattel slavery and appearing for a moment in the same frame as Arbery. Visual language that relies on Black suffering or juxtaposes its joy against its absence continues a dialectic that encourages humans to act in accordance with a deadly script. In our varying degrees of isolation and confinement, the formulation of strategies toward a better way to live become necessary. While uprisings and protests have been underway, monuments to slaveholders across the country have been ripped from their plinths, including the bust of John McDonough in New Orleans. The day I visited Dyson's Black Computational Thought, I considered McDonough's early 19th century manumission scheme in which enslaved people could buy their deportation to Liberia after 15 years of labor. The abstract shapes created by Dyson became new stories as I imagined the persons and personalities of those who animate these abstractions. As such, it is in that beam of light, that ethereal moment before the image is captured, where freedom and autonomy may lie for Black subjectivity, where the existence of a new, fabulous visual language for Black life arises and introduces the possibility for action, one that might mean Ahmaud Arbery could be alive and jogging again today.
Thank you. That's so great and gets at what you were saying about unteaching ways of thinking about history as inevitable, and also about optimism and hope. And in that essay, you talk about photography and the pandemic and racism. And while you mentioned the recent protests surrounding systemic racism and police brutality, you know, as we just heard, you also mentioned the camera as a kind of weapon. And in the essay, you write, Ahmaud Arbery's right to anonymity was violated by the white men who demanded to apprehend him. It was pierced also by the camera lens that rendered him visible in our public consciousness and a decision made by the person recording a video of the scene to abet a literal death. And then on the other side of that, I think, there's been a lot of writing about current social media trends and tendencies to record what is witnessed, which has also led to what seems like an increase in awareness of systemic racism experienced by Black Americans and other people of color and Indigenous persons.
Well, not only that, but so much of the consciousness of Katrina was about film and photography and people taking pictures of what happened there, right?
Can you talk a little bit about what you think about the consequences of photography in contemporary America with regard to Katrina and also this kind of violence?
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? So there's this, there's this history of how people of color and then how specifically Black people enter the canon of photography in the Western imagination, right? Which is via the institution of slavery. And even in a lot of writing, early writing and critical writing about photography, when they're trying to show you a photograph that is supposed to be the photograph that exhibits like a real quality versus a flat quality, it'll be a photo. It was a lot of photos of Black people who had been, abused in the institution of slavery. So they think it was going to like evoke this feeling or something, being just so fundamentally tied to this type of suffering. So something that was really interesting to me, of course, about experiencing the visual of Katrina is that there is the premise is that, okay, I'm exposing and showing this suffering so that in some senses it's supposed to evoke a moral response from the viewer. But if the people who are being shown have been rendered already in the cultural consciousness as non-human, non-deserving, criminal, there's a callousness in the display of their suffering that could not exist in the reverse, right? And so I experienced that via the lens of Katrina, via the lens of the earthquake in Haiti, the way in which, the camera is so comfortable with Black suffering. Like I can show you dozens of, deceased Black people, which we would never see an image like that of white Americans. That's an image we've never seen, in reality in American media. And so also this kind of the premise and a few years ago was that the more videos we have, the more evidence we have that this murder was unjustified, the closer we are to justice. And we've seen video after video after video after video with no justice. So there's something about what the lens presents as, suffering as titillation, as evidence of your positionality as a victim, the reifying of the image, the collective trauma of the image. And so I've thought a lot about the consequences of that particular visibility for Black Americans and then Black people around the world. It has a relationship to these other older images of Black suffering in America of like lynching, mementos that were passed all around the country. And so there's an appetite for this that isn't necessarily to evoke a moral response. And if we had a hypothesis that it could, I think it's sort of been undermined in the past few years. I think that there was a moment where people did think that, body cameras were going to bring us closer to justice.
And also, thinking about it as an artist, and I, I'm white, but I write about race issues, and what you're saying, what the idea that you're saying is like that it's not necessarily like, I think white artists have thought for a long time, hey, if I show this suffering, that will actually bring change, right? And you're suggesting, like, I think in a very, very rational and believable way, like, well, maybe not, maybe the action needs to come before just you collecting an image or writing something is not apparently fixing the problem,
Yeah, because I've already suffered,
Yeah.
The suffering is the thing that we're trying to preempt. you know.
It's interesting as you're talking, I can't help but think of, and we talked about this a little bit last week with Maurice, but I've been watching Lovecraft Country, which I would watch every minute if I could. And I watched the most recent episode and don't want to spoil it for anyone, but felt like such intense joy watching Black characters, for example, in spacesuits, like exploring new territory, meeting other species, like in a context that I like. The imagining of that was so powerful, like a presentation of kind of like a radical joy of Black people not in that position that you're describing. Like it wasn't a reification of victimhood, but in fact of like of empowerment and I don't know, like reconciliation and beauty, which is one of the things that I like about the show so much, that it is subverting, I think, some of the visual language I hadn't even realized that I had imbibed. And I'm often someone who doesn't, like, you know, when a video of like whatever horrendous violence has most recently happened to Black bodies comes out, I don't watch.
Of course, right.
And I think there are people who feel like they watch those things so that they're bearing witness in some way. And I'm not sure what that does.
Yeah. And it's something that I've thought so much about, because of course we've been so inundated with these kinds of images. And I think we're sort of 5 years past the 10th anniversary of Katrina. And I thought about this thing that I had written around the 10th anniversary of Katrina. And I was like, that's what I was writing about then. I was thinking about these videos and this onslaught of imagery. And here we are 5 years later. And, you know, we're this cyclical nature of it. Yeah, I just felt like if there was a hypothesis around that, it's sort of been taken apart in these last 5 years of being inundated with all of these videos that you thought you could never, you know, see or be presented with anything worse.
I do remember people saying, like, these images that are being shown now are going to change the way America does everything. That was happening during Katrina, when you were seeing people on top of their roofs, you know, or in the Superdome, and it didn't.
It didn't, because they developed, you know, a national narrative that said it was your fault. And I think that was the most profound thing about experiencing Katrina, and it has so many reverberations into the present, was this narrative that, you know, the people who were there were there due to their own negligence, or, you know, just, you know, poor people, Black people who hadn't done the right thing. And that's why all of this happened to this, you know, all of that happened to the city.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you all for having me.
It's been a pleasure. And listeners, we will suggest you go visit Kristina's website at KristinaKayRobinson.com to keep up on her latest work.
Thank you so much, Kristina. And you can also, of course, we will link to the site in our show notes, and you'll be able to see images from Republica.
Thank you all.